Good afternoon. Good afternoon, and welcome to episode 67 of the Political Mike podcast. This is a special edition. I'm going to be joined with the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, Dr. Richard Haass, and I'm going to go ahead and introduce him as I'm preparing for him to come on. So Dr. Richard Haass is a veteran diplomat, a prominent voice on American foreign policy, and an established leader of nonprofit institutions. He is in his 19th year as president of the Council on Foreign Relations, an independent, nonpartisan membership organization, think tank, publisher, and educational institution dedicated to being a resource to help people better understand the world and the foreign policy choices facing the United States and other countries. In 2013, he served as the chair of the multi-party negotiations in Northern Ireland that provided the foundation for the 2014 Stormont House Agreement. For his efforts to promote peace and conflict resolution, Dr. Haass received the 2013 Tipperary International Peace Award. From January 2001 to June 2003, Dr. Richard Haass was Director of Policy Planning for the Department of State, where he directed the policy planning staff and was principal advisor to Secretary of State Colin Powell. Confirmed by the U.S. Senate to hold the rank of ambassador, Dr. Haass also served as U.S. coordinator for policy toward the future of Afghanistan and U.S. envoy to the Northern Ireland peace process. Dr. Haass has extensive additional government experience. From 1989 to 1993, he was special assistant to President George H.W. Bush and senior director for Near East and South Asian affairs on the staff of the National Security Council. In 1981, Dr. Haass was awarded the Presidential Citizens Medal for his contributions to the development and articulation of U.S. policy during Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm. Previously, he served in the Department of State from 1981 to 1985 and the Department of Defense from 1979 to 1980, and was a legislative aide in the United States Senate. A Rhodes Scholar, Dr. Haass holds a bachelor's degree from Oberlin College and a master's and doctorate of philosophy degree from Oxford University. He has also received numerous honorary degrees and was a member of the faculty of Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government and Hamilton College. Dr. Richard Haass is the author or editor of 14 books on American foreign policy and one book on management. His latest work, The World, A Brief Introduction, was published last year, and I'm so excited to have him this evening. So I just want to invite you guys to hang on tight. He should be joining soon. But in the meantime, if you have any questions that you would like me to ask Dr. Haass, I would like for you to DM me, send me a private inbox message if you can. We're going to have a really robust discussion on all things foreign policy, and I'm excited to have that now. So stay tuned. We'll be joined by Dr. Haass in just a few moments.
There you go, Mike Taylor.
Dr.
Hey!
Haass, good to see you, sir. Thank you so much, Ms. Bonanno.
I can, Mike,
We
can
can
you
hear
hear
you.
us okay? Good. I don't know
Yes.
who's more surprised, Doreen or me, that we figured out how to do this, but I just want you to know the fact that this is working was, shall we say, not as short as recently as 30 seconds ago. Anyhow, good to see you.
Dr. Haass, it's a privilege and honor to have you on, sir. Thank you for making time. And we have so many young professionals who are excited to hear from you as well. I just gave your introduction.
Good.
Very, very impressive resume and background. And so we're so excited to have your mind.
Well, it's great to be with you all. Thank you. Let's lots to cover. So I'm happy to get started, my friend.
Yes, sir. So the first question I want to start off the conversation with is, of course, pertaining to the war in Ukraine. Is the war in Ukraine, in your view, Putin's war, or does Russia have a discernible strategic interest in Ukraine?
Well, on one level, it's entirely Putin's war. was a war of choice. He decided to launch it based on a number of assumptions, I believe, about how it would likely unfold. Turns out virtually all of those assumptions were wrong. But again, this was Putin's war. It was not one that the Russian people were demanding. Again, it was one that he initiated, and it will leave Russia worse off. It'll be more isolated politically, weaker economically, and depleted militarily. So, in no way is it in Russians' interest. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but this war, again, in no way did it have to happen. In no way should it have happened.
And so that brings me to my next question. Pertaining, as it pertains to the war, in your view, is there any symmetry to the current global disarray that is a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
Not sure I understand what you mean.
I guess what I'm getting at is any symmetry in terms of past events that could serve as prologue here.
Well, that's interesting. One analogy I sometimes use is what happened just over 30 years ago. And in the summer of 1990, the government of Iraq invaded and conquered Kuwait. And the United States, and I know a lot about this because I was the Middle East person on the National Security Council responsible for this part of the world at the time. The United States responded not simply because of our local interests to deal with oil or what have you in the Middle East, but also because we thought that to allow this kind of aggression to take place would set a terrible precedent, and that others around the world would take note and potentially do much the same in their own parts of the world. So the United States led this international coalition that ultimately reversed Iraq's aggression. And I think there are some similarities there now, in the sense that now the United States has, again, helped lead an international response, not as global as the other one was. Indeed, the Soviet Union then and China were essentially quasi-partners with us in 1990 and 91. Needless to say, Russia is the adversary and China is tilting towards Russia and pretty much sitting on the sidelines. But we have galvanized considerable European and also some support in Asia, support for what we're doing. And I think the principles are very much the same, and the stakes, and again, transcend the local stake. It's not that we're not doing this because of Ukraine's strategic importance so much as because of the principle this would set and the threat it would pose to Europe and the world. And there's obviously differences. The last time around, we got involved directly militarily. This is being done indirectly, and the principal reason is that the adversary this time around is a great power. The adversary last time around was a medium power, one without weapons of mass destruction. So we had more freedom of action then. But again, the direction of U.S. policy, I think, was quite consistent. I think we were right then to do what we did, and I think we're essentially right now.
So I love your work, Dr. Haas, World of Brief Introduction. And on page 78,
thank you, sir.
On page 78, you did mention that
you're not going to quiz me. You're not going to quiz me, are you, Mike?
No, no.
What I wrote about you. Okay, good.
No, but one thing that stood out to me is that you said that in your view, NATO enlargement was an error, and that the security concerns of Eastern European states like the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland could have been addressed by other means than bringing them into NATO. So I'm wondering, in light of the fact that Russia's unprovoked aggression against Ukraine has resulted in 5 additional states formally informing, their intentions to enter NATO, or aspirations, I should say, to enter NATO: Bosnia, Herzegovina, Finland, Georgia, and Sweden, and Ukraine. Do you still feel that way in terms of NATO?
It's a very different situation. The reason I was questioning NATO enlargement back then is when NATO enlargement gained momentum, the relationship with, by then, Russia, the former Soviet, the principal part of the former Soviet Union, hadn't yet gained a defined personality. And I was worried that by going ahead with NATO enlargement, we would increase the odds that the relationship would turn out poorly, We also had other vehicles at the time, what was called the Partnership for Peace, for example, in order to include Russia in European security arrangements. At one point, I floated when I was at the State Department about 20 years ago, the idea of bringing Russia into NATO. Again, the whole idea was to have Russia be part of European security rather than see European security as somehow aimed at it. Things have changed now, and Russia has acted in an aggressive way. This war did not happen because of NATO enlargement. It happened because, again, Vladimir Putin decided to do it in no small part because he thought he could get away with it. He didn't think there'd be much of a response from Ukraine or the United States or Europe. Thought his own forces would be far more capable than they've turned out to be. So I think the question is settled. I think that because Russia has reemerged as a significant threat to its neighbors, the rationale for NATO once again exists. I think there was a period after the Cold War in those early years where there was a legitimate debate, and all sorts of people questioned NATO enlargement. Some thought it was necessary or desirable as a hedge against the kind of Russia we've seen emerge. Others thought it was unnecessary and might increase the odds that a hostile Russia would emerge. Look, it's one of those questions that graduate students and others, historians, will argue for the rest of time, because hindsight is not always 2020, and you've got you can't rerun what ifs in history. So I think it was a legitimate debate then. I don't think it's a legitimate debate now. I think we obviously need NATO, and I think the idea that countries like Sweden might be coming into it, I think is a really good thing. And again, it's part of the irony of Mr. Putin's war of choice. Is he's much worse in Russia's strategic situation.
So, Dr. Haas, one of the things that this crisis in Ukraine has, or in the current wars, caused me to think about is the lead up to World War One, and I couldn't help but kind of draw some parallels. In World War One, the lead up to World War One, you had short-term zero-sum thinking, the lack of a clear long-term strategy that many point to and say this is the cause of the outbreak of the war. And that, of course, took place with the backdrop of a lot of nationalism among the European countries. Today, there's a strategic confusion about the sanctions that have been placed on Russia and what they will mean for the future, whether Moscow's policies in Ukraine will serve its long-term interests. At the July crisis in 1914, policymakers on both sides were quick to accuse the other side of fostering aggression. Germany accused the other major powers of undermining the European order by refusing to account for Austria and Hungary's interests. And then today, you have a very narrow narrative in Russia based on the idea of a fascist coup d'etat with Western help. To put it really bluntly, are we in a scenario that's very much headed towards a World War III, in your view?
The short answer is no. I don't believe we'll end up there. Now, could we? Of course, history has unlimited options, but do I think it's likely? No. The one thing that concerns me is you've got leading Russia right now an individual who's essentially unconstrained politically. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union, you had a degree of collective decision making. You had a communist party. You had institutions. This is a personal leadership. The government has essentially boiled down to one man who's, again, essentially unconstrained by other individuals or institutions, and that worries me. But it also worries the Biden administration, and I think it's correctly acted with caution, not having U.S. Troops on the ground, not setting a no-fly zone, and so forth. What we've tried to do is act with a degree of restraint in order to avoid a scenario that might prompt the sort of awful situation that we avoided during the 4 decades of the Cold War. So again, I'm pretty confident, 100% confident, no, but mostly confident that we can continue to navigate this. And look, there's a tension here. Mm-hmm. We want Russian aggression to fail. We want Ukraine to survive as a sovereign, viable entity. Ultimately, we want Ukraine to recover its territory. This world we live in, Mike, doesn't have a lot of rules.
Mhm.
One of the few norms or rules, though, is that borders ought not to be changed through the use of armed force. So it's essential, I would argue, that Russia not succeed. But we want to accomplish these goals in a way that we don't bring the world to a precipice. And that's why we're, in some way, to use a cliche, fighting with one hand tied behind our back. And we set certain limits on what we're prepared to do. And I think that's the tension in U.S. policy. I think it's, all things being equal, correct to try to achieve our goals with limited means. But that's why I believe we are highly likely to avoid what you're talking about. The only reason I can't guarantee it is because of the nature of decision making on the other side.
Right. And so one of the latest developments that I read about the ongoing situation in Ukraine is that there seems to be an inability to get grain, or because of
Yes,
a
sir.
block grain to Ukraine. So in trying to seek a deal or strike a deal that would ensure that both Ukrainian and Russian food and fertilizer exports could safely reach foreign markets, do you think that President Biden should consider easing economic sanctions on Moscow? And I ask that because I know that on page 80 of your book, you say that history suggests that sanctions could rarely change what a government decides to do on issues of major importance.
Well, I sort of feel this interview is a bit unfair because you've read my book much more recently than I have, and it's always a problem as an author to be quoted back to. Look, I think what you suggest is a serious issue, and indeed, I would think there's a decent chance that in coming weeks it'll emerge as one of the main issues, if not the main issue, because the war is almost settling down into a kind of war of attrition where there's not big territorial movement. But this issue of Ukraine's inability to export its grains and seeds and the rest to the world is emerging as a major global issue. It's raised for two reasons. One, there's scarcity of foodstuffs, and then there's, as a result, the price is going up. So a lot of countries that have imported, the Egypts of the world, Bangladesh, Indonesia, some other countries in North Africa and so forth, countries that are dependent on grain, which was often known as the breadbasket, either of the former Soviet Union or the world. These countries are hurting, again, from a shortage of food or seed or from higher prices. So this will cause instability. This will increase refugee flows. This will cause starvation in some places. The Russians know that they're causing it. Indeed, they're not just causing it through their blockade using their navy. Just the other day, they attacked on land near railroad places where grain was being stored. So they've made a bad situation worse in recent days by what they're doing. Now, Putin's obviously trying to use this for leverage along the lines you say, that he would get sanctions eased in order to let up on this. But I don't believe we can let up on the fundamental sanctions because the whole idea is that Russia needs to pay a price. We need to get them to stop this war and to get out of Ukraine. And so I'm not comfortable letting up pressure on that, particularly if it strengthened Russia's ability to sustain the war. We don't want to create a perpetual motion machine here, which is, by the way, what we're doing when Europe continues to buy Russian gas. We are funding Russia's war effort, which is preposterous. So my hunch is we're going to have to probably find other ways of working this issue. And that it's imperfect. We're not going to get anything near the amount of grain out to the rest of the world that we used to. We may have to look for other ways to help some of these countries, but I think that's where we are. But I think this issue that you put your finger on is going to emerge as one of the big associated, if not the biggest associated issue of this war.
Yeah, and it makes me think about a quote from a Biden aide. I believe Politico reported that one of Biden's aides said that Putin is trying to engage in diplomacy by extortion, by refusing to, I guess, by placing Ukraine in a situation where if the United States doesn't play ball with Russia, it's Ukrainians' exports that are on the line. But I do want to pivot a little bit before I transition away from Ukraine. I know our time is limited. But in your view, was the Ukrainian invasion an unavoidable inevitability? That is to say,
nothing's inevitable in history,
Mhm.
but I'm not sure there was any way it could have been avoided once Mr. Putin made the calculations he did. Again, he thought that he could get Ukraine for a very low price. And remember, in 2014, he took Crimea and parts of southern Ukraine and paid a very small price for it. So my view is he thought he could probably do something quite similar. He didn't think the Europeans, who were dependent on Russia for energy and much more, would stand up to him. He saw the United States depart Afghanistan in a rather, shall we say, a messy fashion. Saw us preoccupied with domestic issues. Had doubts about Ukraine's willingness and ability to come together to stand up. So I think Putin calculated, turned out to be wrong, but the calculations weren't crazy, that he could essentially achieve what he saw as significant ends, essentially eliminating Ukraine as a sovereign, independent entity, bringing it into one technically or in a de facto way into Russia's orbit. He believed he could achieve that at a relatively modest price, and that's why he did it. And when the United States was warning people that he might do it, remember when he massed upwards of 200,000 soldiers there, we took some steps to strengthen NATO. But there was, in some ways, it took his invasion to galvanize the sort of response we have. Before the invasion, a lot of people would have said or was saying, well, don't do things that might provoke him. Again, you asked me before about history. That's the same thing happened in the summer of 1990. When the United States wanted to take certain steps, even to perform at one point an exercise in the region, several countries said, no, don't do anything. That'll provoke Saddam Hussein. That makes a conflict more likely. So we held off. And I think one of the lessons is deterrence requires local on-the-scene capability, but often it takes the event itself to create a political environment where you can do certain things.
So, to what extent does Germany's interests with Russia weaken NATO's response to the Russian invasion?
Well, the new German government. It's important to remember that the government that's running Germany now had been in office only weeks before this happened.
Right.
They've done a massive change in a rather small amount of time. They are providing armed help to Ukraine. They fully support diplomatically what we've been trying to do. They have been supporting sanctions, limited sanctions against Russia on coal. I think they're part of the EU oil sanctions. They've decided to roughly double their defense spending. This is extraordinary. Germany and German foreign policy has changed more, in the first month of this war than it changed in decades. And I think this will be a defining event, because I think this was the event in Europe that told Europeans, for 70 years, we thought our biggest fights were over issues with, this or that trade or regulatory policy inside the EU. And what this war told them is that once again, Europe, like it did in the first half of the 20th century, like it did during the Cold War, has to think of matters of war and peace. And so I think this crisis was an enormous wake-up call to Europe. And what we're seeing is the effects of that in Germany, which is, again, even though it's not everything I'd like to see, it's still far more than I ever thought I'd see.
So, being that the United States is currently, the national conversation has shifted a lot to gun control and what can be done on the national scale to curb back these mass shootings happening that seem to be happening, at least now we're getting to the point where it's happening every so often. We almost match the amount of days in the year with the amount of mass shootings that have taken place in 2022 already. To what extent does local politics, gun violence, racial tension, political dysfunction in the United States weaken our position as a leader in the free world, in your view?
Well, let me give you two things. One is I worry about its ability to distract us. And by that, I mean, we've had this focus on Ukraine. But my one question is, how well can we sustain it? And we've got issues, as you mentioned, with gun violence. The abortion issue is going to heat up again in a few weeks when the Supreme Court issues its opinion on the Mississippi case. I live in New York City. This question of crime in cities is and homelessness and what to do about is big. If you were in Texas, border questions are enormous. Everywhere in the country, I would say the biggest issue right now is probably inflation and the price of gasoline. So what's happened is issues like Ukraine get squeezed, pushed off the stage a little bit. And I think we're seeing a little bit of that. And I think for the Biden administration, that's a warning sign. And what they have to do is again and again and again, the president's got to talk about why this is important, why this matters, and that even why we do address domestic needs like gun-related violence or crime in our cities or everything else I just mentioned. We've got to be able to do both. That our future depends upon not just what happens here at home, but also what happens abroad. So I think, and you asked me, how does this affect American foreign policy? That's one. The other way is I think issues like gun violence and the rest really detract from our reputation in the world. I think much of the rest of the world looks at us on these issues of gun violence and they shake their head. They cannot understand why an otherwise mostly successful society would allow this to happen. And I think they lose respect for us. I also think they grow uncomfortable with us. They basically say to themselves, gee, how can we be comfortable putting our fate, our security in the hands of a country that allows this to happen inside its own borders? It reminds them of how different we are in ways that they don't respect or relate to. So I really think it hurts our standing. It also hurts, by the way, our ability to promote democracy around the world, because people see American democracy and they say, I don't want that. Indeed, it helps the Chinese and others whether it was January 6th or this sort of thing, the Chinese show images of dysfunctional America, of violent America, and they put it on television. They go, see, that's why democracy is dangerous. And that's why we don't want any part of it. That's why you, the Chinese people, are better off, even if you don't have all some of the individual freedoms you want. So I think when we don't work well, I think it does a real disservice, not just to ourselves, but to what it is we'd like to stand for.
Yeah. And last time you were on the program, I know we were unsure in terms of, it was very early on in the Biden administration, and we didn't know what President Biden's position on China, like what approach he would take as it pertains to China. We had assumptions and everything, but since then, President Biden is now facing public pressure from America's leading unions on an issue, that has divided his top advisor, and that is extending former President Donald Trump's China tariffs on approximately $300 billion worth of Chinese goods. Of course, these are Section 301 tariffs that would help ease inflation, according to Biden administration officials. But you also have some disagreements within the Biden circle. You have Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo saying this past Sunday that it may make sense to lift some of Trump's China tariffs on products like bicycles. But then you also have other Biden officials saying this would not be in our interest.
No, I'm familiar with the debate. I would lift them. I favor easing the tariffs.
Okay.
For two reasons. One, you mentioned one reason, it would ease inflationary pressures here. Two, the purpose of the tariffs was to bring about certain changes in Chinese economic policy. It's not doing that. So the tariffs are hurting us more than they're changing China. And I think the principal reason that most people now don't want to get rid of the tariffs is that they're worried about political attacks here, that you look soft on China. But there's other ways we can be tough on China. We could join a regional trade agreement in Asia. That would be a way to show we're tough on China. We can increase our support for Taiwan. That would be tough on. But we have lots of ways to show we're tough on China. I don't think using an economic tool that increases inflation here and doesn't bring about changes in the Chinese economic structure or policy, I don't think that's a very smart piece of foreign policy.
And the last question I have for you, Dr. Haas, pertains to our policy in Latin America. Do you think that the Biden administration's well, should the Biden administration have waited to get some concessions from the Venezuelan government, the Cuban government, before they decided to go ahead and loosen sanctions on Maduro's government in Venezuela, and then expand the amount of flights going back and forth?
Well, it's a good question. I don't pretend to be an expert. Look, sometimes you got to invest in a situation. You put that. It's almost like playing a game of poker. You put down a little bit in the end. You ante up, and you basically say, "I'm willing to take a bit of a risk, and I'll make a gesture towards the other side, and we'll see what, if anything, happens. It's not clear to me we're going to get any reward or return on our investment. If it doesn't work, we can always rescind it. We can do other things. So, look, I understand, why we might want to experiment a bit with Venezuela. It's got the world's largest proven oil reserves, and there's a long-term interest in doing something there. On the other hand, they're repressive and then some at home. As are, the Cubans have their own set of, shall we say, problems that they cause for themselves and others. So I'm not wildly optimistic about either initiative. So my guess is these initiatives aren't going to go very far, not going to accomplish much, pretty futile, if you ask me.
Well, Dr. Haas, I just want to thank you so much for making time to be on this program. I'm forever grateful to you. And again, I just want to put a plug in for your incredible book that has taught me a lot, The World, A Brief Introduction. I'd also want to give a shout out to my alma mater, Oakwood University. The director of public policy at the university wanted me to let you know that they are using this textbook and your other book, A World in Disarray,
Fantastic.
as the courses for American diplomacy.
Good to hear that. Mike, you've made my day. Thanks, my friend.
Thank you so much for everything, Dr. Haas.
Take care. Have a great summer.
You too, sir.